So tonight we start another series, a conversation, I hope, that I hope encourages you and equips you. We're going to talk about life's big five, which is a way of saying there's about 5 questions about life that matter most. Origin, where do we come from? How we answer that question has a huge impact on how we live. It also has a huge impact on the next one, what's my destiny? Where I come from has a huge bearing on, so where am I going to end up? And that is going to give me an identity. If I were going to answer the first question with, I came from an accident, then I have no destiny, so my identity is a mistake. Do you follow? One of the things that's interesting is that we live, I would say, my opinion, just looking at things, that we live in a schizophrenic society, which is probably true for several reasons, but what I'm thinking about is, that's a term when you try to be two different things that are typically polar opposite, and we're trying to say two things as a culture right now. We're trying to say that we are a result of a cosmological and biological accident. So we're saying that, and we're saying this is truth, is that we are a cosmological and a biological accident. And then we're trying to say, how come people are mistreating each other? Let me ask it another way. Our society is frustrated by fraud, deceit, and dishonesty. We are upset that CEOs rip off retirement pension funds and things like that. So there is a movement over the last decade, and I'm just broad brush making statements, don't pin me down, it may have been 12 years or 9.5, but generally in the last decade or so, there's been a movement, even in business, to teach at a corporate level business ethics. And the idea of ethics is we need to teach people to be responsible with what they have been given. In other words, don't be stealing or embezzling funds out of people's retirement accounts. And that's a huge example, and then even smaller examples. Because most business owners want trustworthy employees. But here's the strange thing. So you come into a corporate environment, and the task you've been given is to teach ethics. Ethics is a recognition of right behavior and an application of right behavior. That's how I would define it. But there's an unspoken question. The schizophrenia in that is, we are a cosmological, biological accident, but we want to teach ethics. Where does the definition of moral ethics come from? In other words, what's right and wrong? Why is there a compulsion to be ethical? Because one of the hinge pins of the development, the accidental envelopment, is a mechanism called survival of the fittest. We're told the reason that giraffes have extremely long necks is because back in the day, there were short-necked, medium-necked, and long-necked giraffes. There was a variety in the genre of giraffes, if that's even a correct term. But what happened was, there came along a season where the foliage got a little thin, there wasn't a lot of leaves, and so the herd all chewed on leaves and trees and stuff, and of course all of them got the bottom branches, but as the drought continued, the feed that they needed was higher and higher and higher. So what happened was they ate all the low limbs and then all the medium limbs, and when they got to the medium limbs, all the short-necked giraffes starved to death and couldn't have babies. And that's why they're not in the gene pool. But as you keep eating up the tree, finally the only ones that could reach the leaves were the long-necked giraffes, and that's why they survived and had babies. And if they happen to have, due to the what's the word, kind of the random pairing of DNA, you'll still get occasionally blue eyes from two parents who have brown eyes, repressive genes, and there's something, I forget all that stuff. But The point is, even if two long-necked parents had an occasional baby that was a short neck, they died, and so this is called natural selection driven by survival of the fittest. That's why you have long-necked giraffes today, because all the short-necked ones starved to death. It's a simplistic example, but that's one that's in the textbooks. If the mechanism of improvement is survival of the fittest, then what does ethics have to do with that? If it isn't survival of the fittest, get what you can while you can, then we should be cheering those who are able to go home with the most money in their lunchbox. So the weird thing is, we're teaching this thing over here in biology about our origin and about our destiny, which results in a certain identity, which leaves us empty when it comes down to meaning. Who am I? Do I matter? Is there a reason that I'm here? Is life just a connection of random events? It doesn't matter that I'm here. I'm one organism out of a bajillion organisms on the planet, so there's no significance to me. When we reach that conversation in meaning, then we start living a pointless life. What's left potentially is merely the pursuit of pleasure. Just do something you enjoy because that's it. And that leads us back around the wheel. You could go any this way or jump across, but then how do we define morality? Why do we care about morality if we don't know about our origin and about our destiny and about our identity that leads to meaning and so on? So over the next few weeks, I'd like to talk about these 5 things. What I don't want to do is to share these things in any kind of self-righteous or arrogant way. Because even when I'm using the example of the giraffe, I personally think it's laughable. Okay, but I don't want to come across like you're an absolute idiot if you believe that. Because there are good thinking people that are convinced that's how it happened. So if my attitude gets in the way, that's something I'm going to try not to present this conversation in any kind of self-righteous, arrogant, let's make fun of those people, because I'm hoping you know somebody that you might want to invite to this conversation, and therefore this needs to be a safe place. But secondly, brothers and sisters especially, we're called to engage the world that we live in, right? So we need to have these conversations with whomever we can. And a self-righteous or arrogant attitude shuts down any possibility of a conversation. Does that make sense to you? I mean, I don't like being made fun of. I don't like being laughed at. I don't think anybody does. We've already got a special challenge that our society, in my opinion, our culture is losing its ability to have healthy disagreements. We get uncomfortable now as soon as there is a disagreement. It makes us uncomfortable. And then we start withdrawing, or we shut down, or if it's something that really matters to us, we may go on the offensive and attack the other person so that they'll shut down. The point is, do we know how to have a passionate, vigorous disagreement and have a fantastic relationship at the same time? We should, and of all people, Christians ought to be able to do that. Do you agree with me? One of the healthiest things we could do as the people of God, because what Jesus said, remember in the Gospel of John chapter 13, he said, the world will know that you're my disciples by how you love one another, and love is perhaps most clearly seen in times of disagreement. Because the biblical definition of love, like in 1 Corinthians 13, where it says love is patient, love is kind, and love does not keep an account of a wrong suffered, you don't have to do much of that if you always agree. Does anybody remember your first significant argument as a newlywed couple? I'm not asking about the content. You probably don't remember what you were arguing about, but do you remember the experience? Is it safe for you to admit that to me? I'm kind of wondering looking at you. See, this is a part of a deep relationship or a loving relationship is disagreement. Because if we use marriage as an example, do the two of you agree all the time about things that are important? Shake your head this way. No. And if she won't allow you to shake your head, then just shake your head like this to me. I'm just kidding. So I guess one of my soapboxes is the church ought to be a shining light of healthy disagreement. Just even in our crowd tonight, are there any differences of opinions, do you think, in this room tonight? Yeah, I'm getting to know some of you enough to go, yeah, absolutely. But that should be to us engaging and energizing and even fun. If we go into a disagreement with, there's a winner and a loser, then that's hardly ever fun, unless I guess you're the winner and you like people leaving. It's the engagement and the discussion that makes what we do so valuable in community. So as we go along this way, that's going to be my goal and hold me accountable. I don't want to say something that comes across snarky or sarcastic or condescending in this conversation, because those kinds of things are not helpful in an open dialogue. So most of us know folks that think differently than we do. Of course, if that's true in the body of Christ, is it true outside the body of Christ? Of course it is. One of the things between the election season and the arena of social media, we are seeing a disagreement that is incredibly divisive and toxic. We don't present ideas and the best idea wins. We attack the proponents of the ideas. And that's not helping us. So the darker it gets, the brighter the light. The church has an amazing opportunity to really show the world what it's like to live in joy and peace in the middle of disagreement. So as we start down this conversation, we're going to be talking about evidences of our origin, evidences of our destiny. We're going to talk about evidences of our true identity that brings meaning to life. We're going to look at evidences for a morality base that comes from this circle, if you will, of questions. But we got to start in a different place tonight. My grandfather, who's since passed away, he was a Church of Christ preacher all of my growing up years. And of course, my dad is still preaching at the Matador Church of Christ, and I'm doing what I can to do that. And so it's been an interesting perspective. When I asked my grandfather, I said, what were the hot issues when he was a young preacher? And in his day, the big discussion was about which was the proper church to attend. And one of the challenges that he had was that he had difficulty realizing that the world he was preaching to, as I started preaching, wasn't the same as when he started preaching. I'll give you an example. I was talking to him, and I don't remember if I've told you this or not, but I was talking to him one time, and he was fussing about how some of these new churches are too liberal. And I said, well, okay, what does that mean? Because you know how you use words, liberal, progressive, conservative, legalistic, whatever. Okay, but you got to tell me what that means, because whenever the speaker's talking, like when I'm talking about myself, I know that I am fair and balanced and perfectly in the middle because I'm me, right? And so you're either too far this way or too far this way because I'm the example of wisdom, judgment, balance, blah, 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 right? Well, the problem is that's how we all see ourselves, of course, because if we didn't, guess what we would do? We would move to where the right place is. That's what we do. So I said, well, what do you mean too liberal? He said it really frustrated him that churches today, there were men who were kneeling while leading a prayer. It really bothered him. And that was very liberal, and it was too emotive and all that sort of stuff. And I said, well, what do you mean? Tell me more what you mean. He said, sometimes someone will ask to lead a prayer, and they might just go up to the front and kneel in front of everybody and lead a prayer, and it just makes people uncomfortable, blah, blah, blah. Well, I just vaguely remembered, because I was a kid when our church buildings were white board sides and straight wooden pews and all that sort of stuff, and I said, Papa, didn't, when y'all were in those buildings when there was no air conditioning and you had to fight off the wasp and stuff because the windows were open all the time, I have this memory that when men would lead prayer, they would get out of the pew and they would kneel in the aisle and hold on to the side of the pew and they'd pray. Did I remember that correctly? That was in the South. He said, well, yeah. He said, but that was different. Well, we discussed it, and it was a good conversation for both of us because he realized something, but so did I. Because see, as the young man, I have a tendency to disregard the past and make fun of it and talk about, that's ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. And if you're talking extremes, his problem was he was threatened by something different. What we figured out was when we were in small church buildings, the men would kneel in the aisle as a common practice. But as our church buildings got bigger, what would happen Sunday morning if one of our brothers knelt right here with his head down and pray? What would be the problem? Nobody could hear him. So as our auditoriums got bigger, we came up with sound systems, right? And so you create preachers like me. I'm a wimp. If I don't have this, you can't hear me, right? Anybody heard my dad speak? I mean, when they're running the volume for my dad, they put it on a negative, trying to pull some of the volume down. Right? Because when he was a young man, they began to move into buildings of this size, and they didn't have the technology yet for this. So you had to make it happen. So when we first got speakers, what we did is we had two big speakers up front. Remember, the cabinets were this tall, and they were that big, and had that weird-looking foam kind of front. And then they had those cool microphones, big, heavy steel, And every time I'd get as a kid, I kind of felt like Elvis because that's kind of what he had. Well, when you have a one-channel amplifier with the big tubes in the back and it put out like 1,000,000 BTUs of heat and you had cables running that wide and you had a big speaker, a big microphone, where did you have to put the microphone? You got to put it up. You have one, so where do you put it? You put it on the pulpit, right? I mean, that makes sense. So then we did a microphone bolted to a pulpit for at least 25 years. At least. Those of you that are all into that would probably correct me. It's probably longer than that. I remember the first lapel microphones. There were two versions. One was a big plastic hoop you put over your neck, and the microphone was about as big as a grapefruit, and it held, and you had to straighten up because it was... And it had a long cable. And then you could walk around, and there was an art. You had to learn to keep the cable in your hand and flip it as you walked. Because if you stepped over it, my dad had the second generation, which was a big cord, still had the big microphone, but it wasn't the plastic hoop, it was the big cord. And he was preaching. It had a pulpit with a simple one-step podium. We don't use the word stage, we use the word podium because that's scriptural. Anyway, the high part of the floor, can I use that word? The high part of the floor. Well, he'd preach and get to wondering because he could move away from the microphone because they had him tied down. They were recording the lesson, so he couldn't just... So he'd step down, like here's the pulpit. He'd have his corded microphone on, which was plugged in behind because that's where the line came from the amplifier. He'd step down, boy, and he'd be preaching along, and then he'd step back up, and he'd preach for a while, and then he'd step back. He kept doing that. I was there when it happened. Oh yeah. So I don't know if he had a 4 or 5 circuit limit, but there's a limit because I remember when he stepped off and the cord went tight. Jerked him flat on his back. And the best part was that sermon, I remember the title, that sermon was on grace. Kid you not. So I remember the first lapel microphones, and then finally wireless technology caught up to give us this ability, the body pack. And I remember the first lapel, and you had to put, we actually put, one church where I preached at, we put a piece of duct tape on the floor to say, stand in this area, because if you get out of this area, you're going to lose signal. You guys remember that stuff? He's like, yeah, stay in this area. So wireless technology gave us the ability now, in a big room, I had that handheld microphone a minute ago. Somebody could pray where you could hear them anywhere in the room, which is what we used to do when we didn't need amplification. Does that make sense? The second example he was really upset with churches using, he called it pinpoint. And I finally said, "Are you talking about PowerPoint?" But we used pinpoint, and it bothered him. And he was really bothered when some churches started using the songs on the screen instead of the songbook. And you know as well as I do that you turn to the verse that says songbook versus projector, right? But it's what we're used to. There's an emotional connection and so on. And so I asked him, I said, so the problem is about this PowerPoint multimedia presentation that's watering it down or changing it or something. It's entertainment, whatever. Yeah. He used to spend hours. Does anybody remember the chart sermons? Where you take a bed sheet and you iron it flat and you put the stencils on it. And I helped my dad one time. He folded it and we put 2 thumbtacks and I tied yarn to it so that he could, when he was ready, because that way you wouldn't see it the whole time. When he's ready, he could dramatically pull the string and the thumbtacks would pop out and they'd curl down. I thought it was pretty cool. Neither one of us realized we didn't know where the thumbtacks went. They went out in the crowd. So there's not a lot of difference, is there, between a chart drawing stenciled thing and an electronic version? So those conversations with my grandfather were very interesting to me, but the challenge was trying to bridge with him was that the people that he started teaching as far as the cultural context was quite different than folks I was talking to. Okay, the hard part is, for better or worse, and in this case I would say worse, culture moves like a river. Now it can come back and take directions, but it's moving. And so would you think that the people in our community today think and approach biblical concepts the same way as they did when I started more than 25 years ago? Well, no, of course not. That's why I want to have this conversation, and we got to start tonight with kind of a different way. I'd love to dive right off into these, but we got to talk about this right here. In my opinion, this is one of the biggest challenges in conversations today, is that our culture, part of the schizophrenia, or maybe I should just say trying to make two opposites combine, is that we have a cherished belief. We call it tolerance, but that's really not the right word. The word is relativism, is the fancy word. And what it means is our society's gotten to a place where we really value, this is a chief value, I think, in American culture today, that everybody is entitled to their opinion. Well, that part's not necessarily new, nor anything wrong with it, but it's moved into, it's not just your opinion. Now I would say it this way: everybody is entitled to their own truth. And that's where things change. I don't know that we're tracking as a society the difference between opinion and truth. Opinion is my perception of what I'm seeing. I'll give you an example. Is the room tonight too hot or too cold? Let's take a poll. For all those who think it's too warm, raise your hand. I'm going to raise my hand. I think it's a little too warm in here. I'm going to be brave. Okay. A few. Now, who thinks it's a little too cool? Raise your hand. Okay. Who is not going to raise your hand no matter what I ask you? Okay. Y'all have some trust issues. I will say that typically if you're pretty muscled up like I am, that's part of the... That's also one of my opinions. Anyway, so if the room is too hot or too cold is an opinion. That's my perception of the temperature. Now, if I were to go to wherever a thermostat is, or better, a thermometer, and read it and say it's, whatever it is, 74 degrees in here, that would be truth. That's a fact. Does that make sense so far? But my application of that fact, and that's too hot, that's too cold, that's just right, whatever, that's my opinion. But what happens is, when I get separated from an objective fact, like the thermometer says 74 degrees, my opinion becomes truth. I'm telling you, it's too hot in here, and I'm going to go adjust it. Because the facts are, it's too hot in here. Well, no, that's not a fact, that's a perception. Making sense so far? Well, talking about room temperature and comfort's one thing, but when that has progressed into the idea of morality, man, that gets complicated. When what is right or what is wrong becomes a matter of opinion that is perceived or elevated or applied as if it's truth, keeps us stuck. So, what's the schizophrenia or the challenge is, we absolutely demand truth from loved ones. Would you tolerate a loved one that wasn't telling you the truth? Right? I mean, when we have a relationship with someone, the foundation of a relationship is trust, right? And dishonesty erodes trust. So what we demand from relationships is truth. Did you go to the store? Yes or no? We expect truth when we ask questions. You can't build a relationship without it. We demand truth from doctors. Anybody? When you go to a doctor and they say something's wrong with you, I could throw in a mechanic in this, right? When they say this is what's wrong, you demand that what they speak is truth. You wouldn't tolerate a truth that's true for them but not true for you, but maybe true for another patient. You want to know, is this infection bad or good, or is this particular cell or microbe, is this good or bad? We want truth that's demonstrated factually, right? Thirdly, do we demand truth from stockbrokers? When they give you a recommendation, do you want it to be based on truth or lies? These are 5-star rated companies. What if they're not? Then you don't want to hear something that's not true. So we demand truth in relationships. We demand truth in our physical health. We demand truth in our finances. We demand truth in the courts. We do not want a lie to be propagated. We don't want something to be used that isn't truthful, that affects somebody's outcome. We even have laws on the books called perjury. If you lie, there's supposed to be consequences. Right? Because what are you going to do when somebody's life is on trial if you can't get people to tell the truth? You're in trouble, bad trouble, right? So we demand truth from courts. We demand truth from employers. We don't want them to tell us one thing and then do another. I'll pay you this amount, or this is the benefit package, or this is your job description, or this is the safety hazards, and then that not be true? Woo, we'd be upset quick, wouldn't we? We want truth. I think my favorite one is we demand truth from airlines. If I'm going to get on, like Root went to Argentina and one of the new Boeings, a 777, I want the people that designed and built that thing to have used truth. Not opinion, not feelings, not perception, not perspective. I want facts. Because as an example of absolute truth, see, we understand that physics or gravity or chemistry are absolutes. A really simple example would be if you throw a match into gasoline, what happens? That's why you don't throw a match in gasoline. What you don't want is somebody going, well, that may be true for you, but that ain't true for me. Watch. Well, if you do that, let me go stand over here. Right? Because those are absolute truths, and we depend on it in flying halfway around the world. We even want airlines to speak truth when they talk about prices and schedules, don't we? Anybody get mad if your flight's delayed? Does anybody get upset if you discover a hidden fee? Anybody? So we regularly, and I mean tenaciously, demand absolute truth in all these categories and more. There's one weird exception. When we get to the concept of morality, which one way of defining morality is an understanding or definition of what is right and what is wrong, we get all wonky and fuzzy. There are and this is how when you talk about destiny, you talk about meaning, you talk about identity, there are, I would argue, more serious consequences to moral relativism than if you tried relativism in physics or in engineering. So first of all, we need to be consistent in our desire for truth. We need to be consistent in our demand for truth. And that goes for us, folks. When we're listening to Bible stories or sermons, or whether we're making decisions in our own life, we need to be insistent on truth. Opinion is interesting and it's often helpful, but it's not the same thing. Because we too swim in this current. We too can get caught up with the saying, well, you know, kind of whatever, that's fine. We have to demand truth morally or spiritually like we do in every other category. And really, what I mean by that is not so much fussing at your preachers or Bible class teachers, but rather having a personally increased appetite for truth, that you are personally pursuing it. So, what is truth? This may sound like you got to be kidding me, we're asking this question, but I'm encouraging you. You probably know this, but if we go outside these glass doors, this is a big question that our culture answers really differently across the board. And so my goal is not just maybe to challenge how we think, but better to hopefully equip us to engage in these conversations. Because we hear a lot of whatevers, don't we? Oh, well, you know, that works for you, but that doesn't work for me, or some derivative of that. So let's do a little exploration in John chapter 8, verse 31. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then kind of see where this goes. I want to encourage us that the problems we face today are not new. Don't feel defeated or discouraged. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. From the reading that I have done, from my limited understanding of the first century culture under Greek and then the Roman influence, is that when Jesus came to the earth, the environment he was in was kind of frighteningly similar to ours. Where the Roman Empire was going in its sense of morality and justice and decisions and a view of life, we're right behind them. There's some really disturbing similarities, which just says we keep recycling the same stuff. So the good news is we're not by ourselves, and this isn't new. But listen to what Jesus deals with. In this case, not with pagans, but with really super religious folks. Do really super religious folks, are they ever a pain in the neck? I'm not going to answer that. Verse 31. So Jesus was saying to those Jews who had believed him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. There's three assertions that Jesus makes. First of all, according to this statement, whether, I don't know where you are in your background, but according to what Jesus said, what is the definition of truth according to Jesus? His word, okay. He gives his word as the source of truth. We're going to explore that on the conversation. If you're like, well, I don't know about all that, well, that's what we're going to discuss. I just want you to see the assertion. Number one, Jesus says his word is the definition or is the source of truth. Because eventually you have to decide what the source of truth is. Is it your opinion? Is it your emotion? Is it groupthink? Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the governing body? Is it university professors? I mean, you have to decide what the source is. Is it Oprah? Is it Facebook? Is it your news feed? Is it Google? Is it Wikipedia? Right? You have one because it's the one that influences you, whether you say that out loud or not. Whatever influences you is your source of truth. Which, by the way, says a lot if I spend more time on Facebook than I do in the Bible. What does that set me up for? Failure. Well, yes. Being influenced by one and not the other. So that's the first thing. Secondly, he says, and you will know the truth. Now, what does that mean? You will know the truth. What is that a statement or promise of? You better recognize when you see it that truth is knowable. That's a big deal because right now it's like, well, I know it's all fuzzy. How can you say it's hard to tell? Now, I will say that with an unclear source, like, for example, pick any news story you want to and watch it on CNN, ABC, CBS, and Fox News. Then I'll ask you this, which one's right? Okay. Okay. I said I wouldn't be snarky or sarcastic, so I'm not going to comment. My point is, today, with today's media, and by that I'm talking about social media, I'm talking about internet now, not just TV stations. With today's, maybe a better word so we don't go down the wrong rabbit trail, with the amount of information coming at us, we live with conflicted information every day. Another example I could have said rather than political, that's kind of the obvious one, is which is better for you, butter or margarine? Which is better for you, low carb or high fiber? Or, you see what I mean? Because you can go get all the documentation you can stand on whatever it is that you want to. So we live, that's the other thing. If we had an information explosion, I would say we now have an information delusion. Because there's just, so everybody's stuck with, so what's your source? So Jesus says you can know the truth. He says it's His word. Number two, He said it's recognizable or it's knowable. Eddie?
He says, shall know the truth. And so much hinges upon that word because it's not may. It's not should. It's shall, which leaves no room.
Okay. It also, I thought you were going to say, it also suggests eventually everybody's going to know the same truth too. That'll get to destiny. But yeah, the point here, folks, is Jesus is making some strong assertions, and that's what I want us to recognize tonight. We're going to explore those and see if we can find ways to share those with folks that don't come to. Probably most of us tonight came to the table believing that the Bible is the Word of God. But that's not going to be the starting place with our friends and neighbors most of the time. It may be. Depends on who your friends and neighbors are, I guess. But generally speaking, we don't necessarily have the same starting point. That's why we're going to have this conversation. The third thing he says is the truth will make you free. Those are three beautiful, powerful, life-changing assertions about the nature of truth. The source, I need a better word. I'm going to say knowability. I think I may have made that up just now. And then thirdly, its application changes you for the better, makes you free. Now, what we're dealing with is not new. Watch what happens in verse 33. They answered him, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been enslaved to anyone. So how is it that you say you will become free?" Give me a little Bible history. We're descendants of Abraham. We've never been enslaved to anyone. Is that a...
They're talking, yeah, but they're talking...
Okay, we just had an explosion.
They're talking physical. Jesus is talking spiritual freedom.
True, but I'm just going to stick with their claim. I heard several things.
But no, they have been enslaved many times.
Egypt, Babylon, Syria,
yeah.
Greece. And currently, that's one that gets me.
Is Rome.
When they're standing there talking, what flag's flying over the Capitol? Caesar's, right? So, okay, so we all go, well, duh, what a bunch of morons. How could they say that? Okay, but let's back up. These folks are wrong, okay, but they think they're right. And these are people that if you ask them, they'll say, well, we're doing what's right. So what's going on that somebody could have a history? You could argue the Jews spent more time enslaved than they did free since Abraham. What's going on that they could look Jesus right in the eye and say something so false? Now, it could be that they're just such potent liars and they're so incredibly deep and wicked that they're just lying to his face. Usually that's not the case, though, is it? What's going on that creates that?
Well, they're resisting Jesus and what he's saying.
Okay.
And what he represents.
And the answer, or the question I have is why? If you couldn't hear David, he said they're resisting Jesus, what he represents. Why? Why? There's a huge disconnect right here.
Well, didn't the Jews believe that the Savior was going to come with a sword and not as a Savior? Or, yeah, I don't know the
Okay.
how else to put it.
So personal expectations can filter what you understand as truth or not. So expectations, preferences, comfort, popularity, status. My point is, so there are factors within us that can govern or at least filter what we're able to recognize as truth or not. Does that make sense? If you are given 6 different nutrition plans, which the one that you're going to pick? The one that has chocolate. Right? The one you like. And that's just the first thing that came to my mind, that we will tend to pick, because we have so many options and information today, we will pick what we already like or what we're already interested in or what we already agree with. When's the last time you've read a Bible verse that really challenged what you believed and you had to make an adjustment? Is that because we already know everything? Is it possible there's some Bible verses that could challenge what we think about something? Shake your head this way, please. Yeah. That's a hard process. It's even an exhausting process, but it is a vital one. That's being open to truth rather than filtering out, because for a number of reasons, I don't want to hear it.